Cheap bread and cheap fuel have collapsed more governments than any military invasion in the last 50 years. From Cairo's bread riots to Sri Lanka's first-ever sovereign default, the pattern repeats with brutal consistency. Governments freeze prices to protect households, borrow to cover the gap, and watch debt compound until the system breaks. That same trap is closing right now across dozens of nations, because oil just surged past $90 a barrel. Every government facing a commodity shock gets pushed into the same political fork. Option 1 is to pass international prices through to households and accept immediate social anger. Option 2 is to absorb the difference on the state balance sheet and delay that anger into a future fiscal crisis. In 2022, 132 out of 154 economies studied by the World Bank used some fuel control instrument, with 59 deploying direct fiscal transfers, 61 cutting fuel taxes, and 41 freezing prices entirely. And this is why subsidy policy is so politically sticky, even when it is fiscally dangerous. The social pain of market pricing is immediate, visible, and concentrated in neighborhoods that vote and protest. The fiscal pain of borrowing is delayed, technical, and often buried in accounting language that most households never see. Governments choose the option that is politically survivable now, even if it is economically unsustainable later. Developing economies are structurally more exposed to this decision. Families often spend 40 to 60% of income on food, so even small price moves hit daily survival. A 1% global food shock passes into a 0.34% long-run domestic increase in emerging markets, compared with 0.18% in advanced economies. Temporary shocks can also lift 5-year inflation expectations by up to 0.5 percentage points, which hardens inflation into contracts, wages, and behavior. Once expectations move, stabilization becomes more expensive and slower. Businesses raise prices defensively, workers bargain for inflation insurance, and households bring purchases forward when they can. Those private defensive moves are individually rational, but collectively destabilizing. The state then has to fight both the original shock and the secondary behavior it triggered. Exchange rates then multiply the pressure. Global commodities are dollar-priced, so local currency weakness raises every imported energy and food invoice at once. Egypt lived this sequence when wheat costs surged after the Russia-Ukraine war, while the Egyptian pound weakened sharply. The state did not only pay more for wheat in dollars, it also paid those dollars with a weaker domestic currency. That double exposure is central to the subsidy trap. The government is no longer subsidizing only a commodity. It is also subsidizing exchange rate volatility at the same time. Even if global prices stop climbing, currency weakness can keep domestic subsidy pressure elevated. This is why countries with fragile currencies face recurrent subsidy crises under otherwise similar external shocks. Indonesia shows the mechanics in concentrated form. Domestic production is 605,000 to 620,000 barrels per day, while demand is 1.6 million barrels per day. So the country remains a large net importer. LPG dependence is also high, with 7.8 million tons projected for import in 2026 and roughly 70% sourced from the United States. Budget assumptions near $70 oil and 16,498 to 16,900 rupiah per dollar become fragile if oil reaches 105 and the rupiah weakens to 17,500. And this is where the trap becomes invisible. Indonesia operates a bipartite structure. Explicit subsidies are budgeted up front, while implicit compensation reimburses Pertamina and PLN after they sell below cost. Compensation peaked at 275.3 trillion rupiah in 2022. By February 2026, subsidy and compensation outlays had already reached 51.5 trillion rupiah, or 11.5% of the allocated budget, much of it for old obligations. When liabilities are hidden in delayed compensation, public debate misreads the real fiscal position. Citizens see stable pump prices and stable tariffs, so the policy appears affordable. But the balance sheet is absorbing delayed claims that still require financing, usually at rising rates. Those claims surface, policy options are narrower, and social adjustment is harder. This timing gap is why the trap is called invisible. State-owned enterprises absorb near-term cash deficits first and finance them through short-duration borrowing. Reimbursement can arrive quarters or years later, while contingent liabilities accumulate off-balance sheet. When arrears finally crystallize, the pressure appears all at once in sovereign financing metrics. Debt indicators already show the strain. Indonesia's central government debt reached 9,637.90 trillion rupiah at the end of 2025, equal to 39.86% of GDP. The fiscal deficit widened to 2.92% of GDP, close to the 3% legal ceiling. The 2026 budget projects interest spending at 599.4 trillion rupiah, or roughly 15.9% of total expenditure. At that stage, debt service starts competing directly with development spending. Every extra unit of fiscal space consumed by interest is a unit unavailable for health, education, infrastructure, or targeted protection. This crowding out effect is politically corrosive because citizens experience service pressure without seeing immediate price relief. The policy that was meant to protect households can end up weakening the state's ability to support them. Domar debt sustainability math makes the margin explicit. Nominal GDP growth is 7.8% and effective debt interest is 7.5%, leaving only a 0.3% gap. If that gap turns negative, debt dynamics can become self-reinforcing quickly. In a sustained oil shock path with blanket subsidies maintained, the deficit reaches 3.85% of GDP by 2026, and interest outlays rise to 740.2 trillion rupiah by 2028. Distributional outcomes make the current model even harder to defend. 80% of Indonesia's energy subsidy value is captured by wealthier households with higher fuel and electricity consumption. The bottom 40% receives very limited benefit relative to fiscal cost. The state borrows broadly, but transfer incidence remains heavily skewed. Inflation and debt burden get socialized, while subsidy gains remain concentrated. This regressive structure creates a legitimacy problem as well as a budget problem. The political narrative says subsidies protect the vulnerable, but the incidence pattern says the opposite. When that gap becomes visible, social trust in reform promises also weakens. Durable reform requires not only technical design, but credible communication on who wins and who loses under each option. Electricity policy follows the same pattern. Most tariffs have been effectively frozen since 2017, including households above 1,300 VA, and many small businesses labeled non-subsidized. Compensation for these groups still reached 100.2 trillion rupiah by 2024. The coal domestic market obligation forces 25% of production to PLN at $70 per ton, and implicit coal support exceeded 200 trillion rupiah in 2024. In 2021, closely, Egypt illustrates the same trap in food form. The baladi bread price stayed at 5 piastres per loaf for 36 years, while the government covered 96% of production cost. Bread subsidy cost reached 91 billion Egyptian pounds in fiscal year 2024 to 2025. When authorities finally quadrupled the price in June 2024, the move landed during 29% inflation and no offsetting transfer cushion. Delaying adjustment usually increases the size of the eventual shock. Small, predictable corrections can often be absorbed through targeted compensation and phased sequencing. Large, delayed corrections tend to happen during already fragile macro conditions, when households have the least buffer left. That is why crisis adjustments are more painful than early reforms, even when the arithmetic is known in advance. The stability channel is not anecdotal. Instrumental variable studies, using natural disasters as exogenous shocks, identify a causal link from absolute food prices to unrest. Panel evidence across over 120 countries shows higher conflict and democratic erosion in low-income settings after international food spikes. Equivalent food moves in high-income settings do not show statistically meaningful instability effects. The same price can produce entirely different political outcomes, depending on baseline vulnerability. Historical episodes reinforce that asymmetry. Egypt's 1977 bread riots forced an immediate policy reversal. Haiti saw riots and a prime minister ouster after an 81% imported rice surge in 2008. Sri Lanka held subsidies while resisting exchange rate adjustment until the rupee reached 360 per dollar, then moved through 98% face value restructuring, mass protest, leadership exit, and first-ever sovereign default. Long-run default damage is measurable. Across 221 default episodes, real per capita GDP falls 8.5% below non-default peers within 3 years. After a decade, the gap widens to 20%. Defaults are not short fiscal events, they are development setbacks. Subsidy debt loops can lock countries into lower growth paths long after the original commodity shock. This long horizon is what makes subsidy-driven debt accumulation especially dangerous. The policy looks compassionate in the short run and catastrophic in the long run, so political incentives reward postponement. But postponement compounds principle, raises refinancing risk, and narrows adjustment options. By the time reform is unavoidable, governments are often forced into pro-cyclical austerity. The 2026 Middle East shock reopened all of these fractures. Strait of Hormuz traffic dropped from a 100 to 135 vessel daily baseline to around 90 between March 1st and March 15th. Brent rose 43.2%, placing the move among the largest monthly oil shocks in history. Pakistan then secured a $3.3 billion IMF program, while projecting 50% electricity tariff increases to remove 102 billion rupees of subsidy burden. This is the core vulnerability of import-dependent subsidy states. A geopolitical event far from domestic farms and households can still reset local food and energy affordability in days. Governments then face simultaneous pressure from external creditors, domestic consumers, and political opposition. Without pre-built automatic adjustment tools, emergency policy responses become reactive and unstable. Countries that escape the trap do not rely on universal subsidies. Mexico's Progresa in 1997 replaced blanket price support with targeted conditional transfers to female heads of household, tied to school and clinic participation. Indonesia moved from rastra in-kind rice, where households often received only 1/3 of the 15-kilogram allocation, and effective value was near 2% of poor household spending, to BPNT electronic vouchers. That shift produced a 20% poverty reduction among the poorest groups and at least 15 percentage points improvement in dietary diversity. Jordan used another targeted design under high oil volatility. Fuel subsidies were removed, then compensatory cash support was delivered to 70% of the population with automatic restart triggers when oil exceeded $100 per barrel. This sequence protected households while preserving fiscal control over generalized price distortions. The key principle was sequencing protection before full pass-through, not after social backlash. That sequencing principle is transferable across very different institutional contexts. Households do not need perfectly stable prices. They need predictable protection when volatility spikes. Automatic triggers lower discretionary delay and reduce the political temptation to improvise during panic. Over time, rule-based protection improves credibility for both markets and citizens. India's Jam Trinity expanded this logic at scale by linking Jan Dan accounts, Aadhaar identification, and mobile delivery rails. Over 540 million accounts were integrated, and during COVID, about 80% of target households received at least one digital transfer. Togo showed a fast build variant using voter rolls, satellite data, and machine learning to target neighborhoods without a prior social registry. Digital targeting turned administrative capacity into fiscal precision. Automatic pricing mechanisms provide the institutional backbone for durability. These formulas link domestic prices to international benchmarks, plus exchange rate and distribution costs under independent regulatory oversight. The reform pathway has 5 phases: analytical preparation, compensation architecture before adjustment, product sequencing from premium fuels, formula implementation, and full liberalization with antitrust enforcement. Global experience indicates that complete stabilization takes about 5 years when implementation is disciplined. The 5-phase logic matters because failed reforms often skip the preparation phase. If compensation architecture is weak, social resistance rises before trust can form. If sequencing is rushed, distribution shocks are concentrated, and political backlash accelerates. Durable reform is less about speed and more about ordered execution under transparent rules. Early warning systems help governments survive that transition window. The IMF reported social unrest index, the social stress indicator, built with natural language methods, and IFPRI's excessive food price variability early warning system all improve timing of risk response. Timing matters because reforms often fail politically before they fail economically. Better social signal visibility can preserve reform continuity during volatile adjustment periods. In practice, these systems function as policy radar rather than policy substitutes. They do not remove trade-offs, but they can prevent blind decisions made under noisy information. Early signal quality allows governments to calibrate transfer size, communication strategy, and implementation pace before trust collapses. The difference between manageable adjustment and social rupture is often timing, not intent. Implementation credibility also depends on institutional choreography across ministries. Finance agencies, energy regulators, social protection administrators, and local governments must move in sequence rather than in isolation. If one arm announces reform before another arm delivers compensation, households experience the change as abandonment instead of protection. Coordination quality is a first-order variable in reform success. The global debt backdrop raises urgency. Under the Global Sovereign Debt Monitor 2025, 47 countries are classified as very heavily burdened, spending at least 15% of government revenue on external debt service in 2025 to 2027. Across those countries, 231 million people, or 18% of the population, live in extreme poverty, more than twice the global average. In this context, subsidy debt loops are not temporary fiscal distortions. They are persistent poverty engines. This is why subsidy reform should be framed as social protection reform, not austerity reform. The objective is to replace broad, leaky, debt-funded price suppression with targeted, sustainable household protection. When reform is designed that way, fiscal consolidation and social stabilization can support each other instead of colliding. Without that reframing, governments remain trapped between inflation anger now and debt crisis later. The communication contract with citizens is equally decisive. People can accept difficult adjustments when eligibility rules are clear, transfer delivery is visible, and timelines are credible. They reject adjustment when benefits appear delayed, discretionary, or captured by insiders. Trust is not a soft variable in this system. It is a core transmission mechanism that shapes whether reforms hold or unravel. The evidence from the 1990 Gulf War through the 2026 Middle East crisis points in one direction. Universal, untargeted subsidies buy short-term political calm while compounding long-term fiscal fragility. The durable shift is from subsidizing commodities to subsidizing vulnerable consumers through targeted digital systems and rule-based pricing. Countries that move before the next shock preserve policy sovereignty. Countries that wait usually lose it. Not through invasion or revolution, but through the quiet arithmetic of debt that was borrowed to keep prices low and interest that was never budgeted for.